You take particular individuals and instances for particular purposes in history. There are instruments that I think God raises up for certain purposes and for certain moments in history for accomplishing certain deeds and certain realities.
Can we still have free will if God is ultimately sovereign? And if God doesn't change, why do we seemingly get such a different picture of him in the New Testament than we get in the Old? Tough questions, but we'll hear answers to them today as we hear another Q&A with author and apologist Ravi Zacharias. Welcome to another Friday Q&A on Just Thinking. This week, we're going to hear part 3 of Ravi's interaction with the audience at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Today's program will conclude the first night of Ravi's time at the university. But there are more questions from a second night that will begin airing next Friday. So here's the first question for today.
It's good to hear your voice, Ravi, each Sunday morning at 8 o'clock on our local radio station, CHML 800, AM 900, CHML. For the last couple of years, and one of the programs included the Eastern and Western logic that you mentioned tonight, the both and.
That's
for the
right.
Eastern, the either or for the Western. And I wrote to your office, and I was sent something you wrote in 1987, and I read that over, and your administrative assistant offered some help as well, but I thought, why not come down tonight and ask you in person?
Okay.
And the question relates to God's sovereignty and man's free will, because it's a big question for us who are Christians, and it seems that if we give any little bit, to me anyway, of man's free will, it takes away a bit of God's sovereignty. It's the both and. Like we normally say, I believe in God's sovereignty, I believe in man's free will. That's the both and. That's the Eastern thinking.
Right.
I guess your program helped me come to the conclusion that it's Western thinking, that God, to be sovereign, really can't have man have fully free will.
Can't have?
Can't truly have the free will that we seem to have. And so my question is, how do you resolve the issue in light of the both and the either or logic of the Western
good
and
question,
Eastern thinking?
and these questions take all evening on all semesters to answer. We try to give you vitamin-sized portions here, and so I'll keep it brief. They would only be mutually exclusive if both are absolute, but they are not. My freedom is not absolute. My freedom is qualified. I am given certain parameters within which I may operate. But if I violate those parameters, there are necessary consequences. I never asked to be born with my DNA, but I was given it. I never asked for my parentage, but I was given it. I never asked for my culture, but I was given it. I never asked for my native language of Hindi, but I was given it. There are languages and realities to your being and your birth that are not your free choice. So immediately you know your freedom is not absolute. You are already contained. So when God in His sovereign grace gives you freedom, He is not giving you absolute freedom. To give you absolute freedom would be to make you God in a sense, to make you completely dominant over all of reality, but it can't be. He gives you the parameters and said you can do this and this and this and this, except in the day that you do that, you will surely die. But if you eat of this and drink of this, you will find life. So I do not see them as mutually exclusive. It is not a both and. There are not two absolutes at stake. Now, the second part of it is this, that if you see the scriptures, they come through with this. Jesus said, offenses must come, but woe unto him through whom they come. Paul went on to say, work out your own salvation, for it is God that worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Peter said, that which was foreordained from before the foundation of the world, you with wicked hands have taken and crucified. So they hold these points in tension, that there is responsibility, but there is not absolute sovereignty over your life. So a contradiction is where there are two absolutes in mutual exclusivity. And I'd see this more as a paradox rather than an absolute negation.
I just wondered about Jacob and Esau having been chosen before they were born. Both sinners, but one was chosen, and one was not.
Yeah, and then you go back to Pharaoh and all of those too. Two things I want to say to you there. First of all, when you look at Moses and you look at Paul and you look at these specific family trees and all that come in, to take particular individuals or even the land as it was originally given to Israel. You take particular individuals and instances for particular purposes in history. There are instruments that I think God raises up for certain purposes and for certain moments in history for accomplishing certain deeds and certain realities. I don't think those particulars and exceptions should ever be extrapolated into making it commonplace for all of humanity. That's the way I've always seen it. And I think that's the way the Bible seemed to. Paul and Moses, two very single individuals, and Jacob and Esau in the same thing. And yet I think when you look at the cry, for example, of Ishmael as the descendants, when the cry is made, oh, that Ishmael might live, and God granted that request. So I think there are intercessory acts that bring about some kind of compensatory balance rather than a radical polarization of yea and nay between the two. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, Christians believe that Jesus Christ and God are one, like Jesus is God, and also that God never changes. And also, you said that Jesus values our lives, each one of us, especially. But if he's the same God and he never changes, how do you explain the acts of the Old Testament where genocide is committed to other nations?
Say the last statement. How do you explain?
Genocide? Almost genocide. And I feel like it's almost cruelty against the nations in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So.
Great question, and mouthful of a question on which to end. If God never changes and God values the individual, then how does one explain genocide? There's so many other instances in the Old Testament where your head is thrown back and you say, whoa, how did this come about? Your question is so weighted philosophically first and then interpretationally in the scriptures that I first want to establish the philosophical side of it. And it is very important that we understand this. It may take me about 5 or 10 minutes, so just stay put where you are and try to let me do my best. I remember a man in the University of Nottingham once shouting at me and saying, how can a God of love and justice allow such evil in this world? And I asked him what he meant by evil. Because if you say there's such a thing as evil, you assume there's such a thing as good. If you assume there's such a thing as good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. If you assume there's such a thing as a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom he was trying to disprove and not prove. If there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there is no good. If there is no good, there is no evil. What is the question? You see, so philosophically you must remember that when you raise a question like this, you don't kick God out of the paradigm. God is very much in the paradigm. And you can only find an answer if I've just finished writing an article. I mentioned this the other night on tsunami to talk about how so many died. It is fascinating to me that many animals didn't die. The animals went and found shelter long before the waves reached shore, so naturalism's got a problem. The lesser knew how to survive and the greater didn't know. You've got all kinds of questions that come as a result. So with God in the paradigm, that's when your answer should be found. When you read the Old Testament, you find a very clear description, and this is hard for you and me to understand, that when you violate God's law, there is a moment of judgment that comes, and part of that judgment is suffering, pain, and grief. Sometimes with an invading army, sometimes with the elements, sometimes with disease. It is something that we do not like to understand one bit, because we say to ourselves we would have solved it without all of this. But if the human heart has to get a glimpse of wickedness and come for mercy, then the embodiment of the soul has to be visible. So I believe when you take the worldview of the Old and New Testaments, those things happening is very much in keeping with what God was from the beginning. He said to Adam and Eve, in the day that you do this, you will surely die. And when you see what happens with Abel and Cain killing his brother, violence coming in, sensuality coming in, these are the entailments not of God. These are the entailments of our choice to live without Him. C.S. Lewis said there are two kinds of people in this world, those who bend their knee to God and they say to God, your will be done, or those who refuse to bend their knee to God and God says to them, all right, your will be done. And what you see in Old Testament ramification is what happens when I say, my will be done. To not see the entailments of sin is to make sin less than what it is. And to not be willing to face the tragedy of sin is to make us different to who we really are. The human mind is given the freedom to choose. And the problem really is not genocide. The problem is not 150,000 dying. The problem is not that the Nazis killed 6 million. The problem is to kill one illegitimately. So it's not the volume that creates the problem. It's the reality that is the problem. And the reality we must understand that God has reminded us that this kind of thing is exactly what happens when you reject Him. And I believe for those who live, there's a chapter in my book, Cries of the Heart, and I'll just close with this, which is God the author of suffering. And I would encourage you to read the arguments as I have tracked it out there. And one of the things I say at the end of it is that any time you see the abundance of evil, the heart gets harder and harder and harder. And then you see one act of goodness and it cracks open that heart once again to alert you to what is right. So when you see masses of evil going on in the Old Testament and you come to the cross, you need to understand all of that in the light of the cross, and let the cross tenderize your heart, who before the foundation of the world was chosen to come and be the sacrifice for our sin.